Picture this, it's April 11, 1951, and President Harry Truman is sitting alone in the Oval Office, holding a single piece of paper in his hands. This isn't just any document. This paper is about to end the career of the most famous general in American history. It's the order that will fire General Douglas MacArthur, stripping him of every command he holds in Korea and Japan. Truman has already signed it. In just a few hours, this order will arrive in Tokyo, and the biggest showdown between a president and a general that America has ever seen will finally reach its breaking point. But here's the thing most people don't understand. This whole situation wasn't really about Korea at all. This was about fixing a mistake that Franklin Roosevelt had made during World War II, a mistake that lasted 5 whole years. It was a mistake that had bothered Truman ever since he became president, and now, 6 years after Roosevelt's death, Truman had made up his mind. He would never, ever make the same mistake. He would never let a general think he was more powerful than the president himself. To really understand why Truman fired MacArthur, we actually need to go back to 1942, right in the middle of World War II. Douglas MacArthur was commanding Allied forces in the Pacific Ocean, fighting against Japan. MacArthur had just escaped from the Philippines when Japanese troops took over the islands, and when he left, he made his famous promise. "I shall return." The American propaganda machine turned him into a superhero, painting him as this brilliant general who would single-handedly lead America to victory against Japan. President Roosevelt needed that story. He needed MacArthur's larger-than-life personality to keep American spirits high during the dark days of the war. But Roosevelt knew something that the American public didn't know. MacArthur was almost impossible to control. He regularly ignored orders from the president, made his own decisions without asking permission, and basically acted like he didn't answer to anyone. This pattern started really early. In July 1942, Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff made an important decision about how to fight Japan. They decided that the main offensive should go through the Central Pacific, with Admiral Chester Nimitz in charge, while MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area would be a secondary front. From a military strategy standpoint, this made complete sense. The Navy-focused Central Pacific route was shorter and would let America use its powerful Navy more effectively. But MacArthur absolutely hated this plan. He wanted the main offensive to go through his Southwest Pacific Command, moving through New Guinea and then the Philippines. Sure, it would take longer and cost more American lives, but it would make Douglas MacArthur the hero who liberated the Philippines and defeated Japan. And that's what MacArthur really cared about, being the hero. MacArthur didn't just disagree quietly through the proper military channels. Oh no, he went completely around Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs. He gave interviews to journalists who loved him, he leaked classified information to Republican congressmen who opposed Roosevelt, and he made public statements that directly contradicted what the president had decided. He told reporters that the Central Pacific strategy was just the Navy trying to grab power and glory, and that only his strategy could win the war efficiently. He even suggested that Roosevelt was making military decisions based on politics instead of what would actually work. This was serious insubordination, the kind of behavior that borders on mutiny. So what did Roosevelt do about it? Absolutely nothing. Roosevelt was annoyed, sure. He complained to his aides that MacArthur was impossible to manage. But Roosevelt never punished MacArthur, never publicly called him out, never even threatened to fire him. Why would Roosevelt let this slide? Because Roosevelt made a cold political calculation. MacArthur was too popular with the American people to fire. Republicans in Congress loved him. The newspapers treated him like a god. If Roosevelt fired MacArthur, it would create a massive political firestorm that could seriously hurt Roosevelt's chances of winning the 1944 presidential election. So Roosevelt just gave in. He gave MacArthur more troops and resources than the strategy really needed, and he let the general do whatever he wanted. The worst incident happened in 1944. Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs had reluctantly agreed to invade the Philippines, just like MacArthur demanded, even though they still thought it made more sense to bypass the Philippines and go straight to Formosa. The landings at Leyte Gulf were scheduled for October 1944. But MacArthur, with his massive ego, decided to stage a public relations show that made Roosevelt absolutely furious, but which Roosevelt still refused to punish. MacArthur arranged everything so he could wade ashore at Leyte with photographers right there to capture the moment, and he delivered his "I have returned" speech directly to the cameras. It was pure theater, carefully planned out for maximum drama and publicity. But here's the crazy part. MacArthur waited ashore hours before the beach was actually safe and secure. He put himself and his entire staff in danger just to get a good photograph. Even worse, he didn't tell his naval commanders or his Air Force commanders what he was planning, so they had to scramble at the last minute to protect the general during his publicity stunt. When Roosevelt found out about this reckless behavior, he was absolutely livid. He told his military aide, Admiral William Leahy, "That's the most reckless, self-centered thing I've ever heard. MacArthur risked his life and his staff's lives for a photograph. What if a Japanese sniper had killed him? The entire Pacific Command structure would have fallen apart." Leahy asked Roosevelt what he wanted to do about it. Roosevelt's answer was painfully simple. "Nothing. We can't do anything. He's too popular." This was classic Roosevelt behavior. He could see the problem clearly. He complained about it to people he trusted, but he refused to actually confront MacArthur because it might cost him politically. MacArthur's insubordination just kept going right through the end of the war. In March 1945, MacArthur publicly criticized the decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, saying his ground forces could win the war without them if they just got proper support. He was directly contradicting presidential policy and questioning the weapon that Truman would soon have to decide whether to actually use. And once again, there were no consequences for MacArthur's behavior. Then in August 1945, after Japan finally surrendered, MacArthur basically made himself the American Emperor of Japan, issuing orders and making policy decisions that went way beyond what his military authority actually allowed. When Harry Truman became president in April 1945, he inherited this whole mess. A general who had spent 3 years ignoring what the president wanted and had never faced any consequences for it. Truman had been an artillery captain in World War I, so he understood military discipline and how the chain of command was supposed to work. He was shocked by what he saw. He told his staff, "Roosevelt let MacArthur run wild because he was afraid of what would happen politically if he tried to control him. That was a mistake. Civilian control of the military isn't something we can choose to do or not do. It's in the Constitution, and I will not compromise on it, period." But Truman didn't act right away. In 1945 and 1946, with World War II just barely over and MacArthur running the occupation of Japan, Truman decided it wasn't the right time for a big confrontation. MacArthur was actually doing a reasonably good job in Japan, putting democratic reforms in place and managing the occupation with at least some competence. The political cost of firing him would be enormous, and Truman already had plenty of other problems to deal with. So Truman watched carefully, waited patiently, and quietly wrote down every single time MacArthur disobeyed orders, building a case file he might need to use someday. That day finally came on June 25, 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea without warning. Truman, working through the United Nations, committed American military forces to defend South Korea from the communist invasion. And he appointed Douglas MacArthur as the commander of all UN forces in Korea. On the surface, this seemed like a logical choice. MacArthur was already based in Japan, he knew the region well, and he was still America's most celebrated and famous general. But Truman knew this decision was risky. He told Dean Acheson, his Secretary of State, "I'm giving MacArthur this command, but I'm going to watch him very closely. He's got a long history of thinking he knows better than the president. If he tries to pull that nonsense with me, I will fire him. I don't care how popular he is with the American people." The warning signs showed up immediately. In July 1950, just 1 month into the Korean War, MacArthur flew to Formosa, which we now call Taiwan, to meet with Chiang Kai-shek, and he did this without getting authorization from Truman first. MacArthur's visit was seen by everyone as America committing to defend Taiwan against Communist China, which completely contradicted Truman's policy of staying out of the Chinese Civil War. When Truman demanded an explanation, MacArthur claimed it was just a friendly courtesy visit with no policy implications whatsoever. Truman didn't believe him for a second, but he let it go with just a warning. Then in August, MacArthur sent a message to a Veterans of Foreign Wars convention that directly criticized Truman's entire Asia policy, arguing for a much more aggressive approach toward Communist China. Truman was absolutely furious and immediately ordered MacArthur to withdraw the message. MacArthur did technically withdraw it, but only after it had already been published in newspapers all across the country. It was calculated insubordination. Make it look like you're obeying orders while making sure the damage is already done. Truman told his staff. This is exactly the same thing Roosevelt put up with from MacArthur during the war. I will not tolerate it. One more incident like this and he's finished. The real crisis came in late November 1950. MacArthur had launched a major military offensive designed to end the Korean War quickly. He promised Truman that American forces would be home by Christmas, that the war would be over in just a few weeks. MacArthur had assured both Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff that there was very little risk of China getting involved in the war. He was catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. On November 25, 300,000 Chinese troops came pouring across the Yalu River and crashed into MacArthur's overextended, spread-out forces. It was one of the worst military defeats in all of American history. American and UN forces were forced into a desperate, chaotic retreat through the freezing Korean winter. And MacArthur's response to this disaster? He blamed everyone except himself, and he demanded a massive expansion of the war. He wanted to bomb China, including possibly using atomic bombs on Chinese cities. He wanted to bring nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to invade mainland China. He basically wanted to start World War III. And when Truman said absolutely not, when Truman made it crystal clear that the United States would not expand the war into China, MacArthur began publicly undermining the president. In December 1950, MacArthur gave an interview to U.S. News and World Report where he criticized Truman's limited war strategy. Then in March 1951, MacArthur issued a public statement threatening China with expanded military action if they didn't negotiate a surrender on his terms, directly sabotaging Truman's careful diplomatic efforts to arrange a ceasefire and end the fighting. Then came the final straw that broke everything. On April 5, 1951, House Republican leader Joseph Martin stood up on the floor of Congress and read out loud a letter from MacArthur that criticized Truman's Korea policy and argued for MacArthur's alternative strategy instead. Truman read that letter and made his decision immediately, right there on the spot. He called in his top advisors, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley, and Chief of Staff Averell Harriman. Truman told them in no uncertain terms, "Gentlemen, MacArthur has left me absolutely no choice. He's publicly defying presidential authority. He's trying to dictate foreign policy. He's attempting to start a much wider war that I have explicitly forbidden him to start. This is insubordination, plain and simple, and I am going to relieve him of his command." The advisors were split on this decision. George Marshall, who was himself a five-star general and the most respected military figure in all of America, supported Truman's decision completely. He said, "Mr. President, military officers don't get to make foreign policy decisions. They don't get to publicly contradict the commander-in-chief. MacArthur has crossed a line that simply can't be uncrossed. You have to fire him." Omar Bradley agreed without hesitation. "MacArthur has forgotten that he works for you, not the other way around. This isn't really about Korea strategy anymore. It's about civilian control of the military. You have to take action." But Averell Harriman, who was the political expert in the room, gave Truman a serious warning. "Mr. President, this will be the most controversial decision of your entire presidency. MacArthur is beloved by millions of Americans. You'll be accused of losing Korea, of giving in to communism, of firing a great general because of petty personal spite. Republicans will absolutely crucify you in the press and in Congress. Your approval ratings, which are already not great, will completely tank. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Truman's response came immediately and firmly, without any hesitation whatsoever. Avril, I don't care about any of that. Franklin Roosevelt let MacArthur run roughshod over presidential authority for 5 solid years during World War II because he was worried about the political consequences of standing up to him. It was wrong back then, and it would be wrong now. The Constitution says very clearly that the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the military, not MacArthur. It's me. And I am going to enforce that constitutional principle, no matter what it costs me personally. Over the next few days, Truman carefully reviewed every single instance of MacArthur's insubordination since the Korean War started in June 1950, building an absolutely overwhelming case against him. George Marshall helped by documenting everything from the military's perspective. The evidence was damning. MacArthur had repeatedly disobeyed direct orders, he had badly misled his superiors about the risk of Chinese intervention, and now he was publicly advocating for policies that could easily trigger World War III. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously supported relieving MacArthur of his command. Even they, who were all military officers themselves, recognized that MacArthur had gone way too far. On April 9th, Truman met with his advisors one final time to make absolutely sure everyone was on board. He looked each advisor in the eye and asked them directly, "Do you support relieving General MacArthur of his command?" Marshall said yes without hesitation. Bradley said yes. All the other Joint Chiefs said yes. Atchison said yes. Harriman, the political advisor who understood just how bad this would be for Truman politically, hesitated for a long moment but finally said, "Mr. President, politically this is going to be an absolute disaster for you. But constitutionally, it's absolutely necessary. So yes, I support this decision." Truman nodded and said simply, "Then it's decided. Draft the order right now." The order was drafted that same evening, and it was brutally simple and direct. "I deeply regret that it becomes my duty as President and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Military Forces to replace you as Supreme Commander Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief Far East, and Commanding General U.S. Army Far East. You will turn over all of your commands, effective immediately, to Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway." Truman signed the order on April 10th, putting his signature on what he knew would be one of the most controversial decisions any president had ever made. The plan was to deliver the firing order to MacArthur through proper military channels on April 12th, giving MacArthur a little bit of time to prepare for this massive transition. But then on April 11th, disaster struck. A reporter somehow got wind of the story. Truman's press secretary came running to him with urgent news. The Chicago Tribune newspaper was about to publish that MacArthur was being fired. If MacArthur found out he was fired by reading about it in a newspaper instead of through official military channels, it would be an additional and completely unnecessary humiliation for the general. Truman had to make a split-second decision, and he made it: announce the firing immediately, right now, before the newspapers could publish the story. At 1 o'clock in the morning on April 11, 1951, President Truman held an emergency press conference to announce that General Douglas MacArthur had been relieved of all his commands, effective immediately. The reporters in the room were absolutely stunned. They could barely believe what they were hearing. By the time the sun came up, the news was on every single radio station and on the front page of every newspaper in America. President Truman had fired General MacArthur, and the reaction from the American people was absolutely explosive. Republicans in Congress were absolutely furious. Senator Joseph McCarthy, the famous anti-communist crusader, called Truman's decision the greatest victory the communists have ever won. Senator Richard Nixon, who would later become president himself, said that Truman had completely lost his nerve. Senator Robert Taft went even further and suggested that Truman should actually be impeached and removed from office. Newspapers all across the country condemned Truman's decision in harsh terms. Truman's approval rating, which was already pretty low because of the stalemate in Korea, dropped all the way down to just 23%, making it one of the lowest presidential approval ratings ever recorded in American history. Truman started receiving actual death threats against his life. Telegrams poured into the White House by the thousands, and they were running 20-1 against his decision to fire MacArthur. The American people were furious at their president. But through all of this intense criticism and anger, Truman never wavered, not even for a moment. In a cabinet meeting the day after he fired MacArthur, Truman carefully explained his reasoning to his team. "Gentlemen, I know this decision is extremely unpopular with the American people. I know MacArthur is seen as a hero by millions of Americans. But the constitutional principle at stake here is far more important than my personal popularity or poll numbers. If I let MacArthur defy presidential authority without facing any consequences, I would be establishing a dangerous precedent that generals can make foreign policy on their own, that they can publicly contradict the commander-in-chief whenever they feel like it, that they can simply refuse to follow orders they personally disagree with. That's not how democracies work at all. That's actually how military dictatorships get started." Then Truman said something that revealed just how much Roosevelt's mistake during World War II had influenced his thinking on this whole situation. Roosevelt faced this exact same situation with MacArthur during World War II. MacArthur regularly ignored direct orders, he undermined official policy, and he put his own personal ambitions ahead of military objectives. And Roosevelt did absolutely nothing about it because he was afraid of what it would cost him politically. That was wrong. It set a terrible precedent that MacArthur could operate completely outside of civilian control. I'm correcting that mistake right now. Yes, it's costing me dearly in political terms, but some things in life are far more important than poll numbers and popularity ratings. Meanwhile, MacArthur returned to the United States and received an absolute hero's welcome from the American people. 7 million people lined the streets of San Francisco for his parade, cheering and waving American flags. He then traveled to Washington, D.C. and addressed a joint session of Congress, giving his now famous "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away" speech that literally had many representatives openly crying with emotion. Republican leaders immediately began pushing MacArthur hard to run for president in the 1952 election so he could challenge Truman and vindicate himself. The national mood seemed overwhelmingly pro-MacArthur and strongly anti-Truman. It looked like Truman had made a catastrophic political mistake that would destroy his presidency. But then something really interesting started to happen that nobody expected. The Senate decided to hold official hearings on MacArthur's dismissal to investigate what had actually happened. For weeks and weeks, senators carefully questioned MacArthur, questioned all the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and questioned all of Truman's advisors about what had really happened in Korea and why the decision to fire MacArthur was made. And the more MacArthur testified and answered questions, the worse he looked to the American people. He came across as arrogant, dismissive of senators' legitimate questions, and openly contemptuous of the entire concept of civilian authority over the military. Under questioning, he openly admitted that he had disagreed with presidential policy, and had deliberately taken actions designed to undermine that policy. He confirmed that he had wanted to massively expand the war into China and even use atomic weapons, going directly against explicit presidential orders that forbade him from doing exactly that. Meanwhile, all the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified strongly in support of Truman's decision to fire MacArthur. General Omar Bradley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and one of America's most respected military leaders, gave absolutely devastating testimony against MacArthur. He told the Senate committee, "General MacArthur's proposed strategy would have involved us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy." He carefully explained to the senators that MacArthur had repeatedly disobeyed direct orders from his superiors, he had badly misled everyone about what the Chinese would do, and he was actively trying to dictate foreign policy decisions that were way above his authority level. Even Republican senators on the committee were visibly shaken by just how clearly MacArthur had overstepped his proper authority. Slowly but surely, public opinion started to shift in Truman's favor. Regular Americans started asking themselves important questions. If all the other top generals agreed that MacArthur had to be fired, maybe President Truman was actually right about this. If MacArthur was willing to risk starting World War III by going against direct presidential orders, maybe he really was dangerous and out of control. MacArthur's approval ratings began dropping steadily as more and more people realized he had been genuinely insubordinate and recklessly irresponsible. By the summer of 1951, more Americans actually supported Truman's decision to fire MacArthur than opposed it. The tide of public opinion had completely turned around. MacArthur's political career collapsed entirely. He decided not to run for president in 1952 after all. He quietly faded into retirement, giving occasional speeches here and there but no longer being a major political force in America. Meanwhile, Truman's decision to fire him gradually became recognized and celebrated as an act of real courage and constitutional principle. Historians started comparing it favorably to President Lincoln's struggles with General McClellan during the Civil War, another famous general who had mistakenly thought himself more important than the president he served under. In later years, long after he left office, Truman often spoke publicly about his decision to fire MacArthur. In a 1961 interview, he explained his thinking this way. Roosevelt let MacArthur get away with insubordination for years and years during World War II. It was politically easier than confronting him directly, but it was absolutely wrong and it created a terrible situation where MacArthur genuinely thought he was completely untouchable. When I became president, I decided very early on that I would never make that same mistake. When MacArthur directly defied me and my authority, I fired him. It's as simple as that. A general who won't follow orders isn't really a general at all. He's actually a serious threat to democracy itself. Truman also spent time reflecting on what Roosevelt's mistake had ultimately caused. If Roosevelt had properly disciplined MacArthur way back in 1942 or 1943, if he had made it crystal clear that generals serve at the president's pleasure and absolutely must follow orders from their civilian superiors, maybe MacArthur wouldn't have thought he could defy me in 1951. Maybe he would have clearly understood that his job was to implement policy decisions, not to make those policy decisions himself. But Roosevelt didn't do that. He took the easy path politically, and years later I had to clean up the mess that decision created. The firing of MacArthur established a crucial constitutional principle that still endures in America today. Generals serve the president, never the other way around. No matter how famous a general becomes, no matter how many military victories they achieve, no matter how beloved they are by the American people, the president has the absolute constitutional authority to relieve that general of command at any time. Truman paid an absolutely enormous political price for enforcing that vital principle, but he never once regretted making that decision. The contrast between how Roosevelt handled MacArthur and how Truman handled MacArthur reveals something really important about both presidents and their characters. Roosevelt was absolutely brilliant at many things, but he definitely had a tendency to avoid direct confrontations that might cost him politically, even when basic principles demanded that confrontation happen. He let MacArthur run completely wild because firing him would have been deeply unpopular with voters. Truman, on the other hand, was willing to do what was constitutionally right, even when doing so was complete political suicide. He fired MacArthur because the Constitution and the fundamental principle of civilian control over the military absolutely demanded it, regardless of what it would cost him personally. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, who was himself a five-star general and the hero of D-Day, was elected President of the United States. One of his very first actions after winning the election was to visit former President Truman for the traditional transition meeting between the outgoing and incoming presidents. During their private meeting, Eisenhower personally thanked Truman for having the courage to fire MacArthur. Eisenhower explained his reasoning. "You did exactly what had to be done, Harry. MacArthur had completely forgotten that in our American system, the military serves the civilian government, not the other way around. You reminded everyone of that absolutely crucial principle, including everyone in the military itself." He then added something really significant. "Your decision actually made my job as president much easier, because no general will ever again think that he's somehow above presidential authority, or that he can ignore orders from his commander-in-chief." Truman's response to Eisenhower revealed just how much Roosevelt's earlier mistake had driven his own decision-making. I learned an important lesson from watching Roosevelt let MacArthur get away with insubordination during the war. Roosevelt was truly a great president in so many ways, but he made a serious mistake by not controlling MacArthur when he had the chance. I made up my mind that I wasn't going to repeat that mistake, no matter what. The Constitution isn't something that's optional depending on political circumstances. Civilian control of the military isn't something we can negotiate or compromise on. MacArthur forgot both of those fundamental truths. I reminded him, even though it nearly destroyed my presidency. The firing of Douglas MacArthur was ultimately Harry Truman's way of correcting Franklin Roosevelt's mistake, of firmly establishing once and for all that no general, no matter how famous or successful or beloved they might be, is bigger or more important than the Constitution itself. It cost Truman enormously in political terms in the short run, with his approval ratings dropping to historic lows and his reputation being savagely attacked from all sides. But in the long run, his decision preserved one of the most fundamental principles of American democracy, that the military must always answer to elected civilian authority, and that presidents must have the courage to enforce that principle regardless of the political consequences they might face. Looking back on it now with the benefit of historical perspective, Truman's firing of MacArthur stands as one of the single most courageous decisions in all of presidential history. Not simply because MacArthur was strategically wrong about expanding the war, though he definitely was wrong. Not simply because MacArthur was guilty of serious insubordination, though he absolutely was guilty. But because Harry Truman was willing to sacrifice his own political standing, his own popularity, and possibly even his place in history to preserve a vital constitutional principle that goes to the very heart of how American democracy functions. He carefully studied Franklin Roosevelt's mistake with MacArthur during World War II, he learned the right lessons from that mistake, and then he had the courage to refuse to repeat it, no matter what it cost him personally. And that willingness to do what was right instead of what was popular or politically safe is exactly what made Harry Truman, at least in this one crucial instance, a better president than even the legendary Franklin Roosevelt. He had the raw courage to do what was constitutionally right, even when doing so was politically devastating and might destroy everything he had worked for his entire life.